So I'm Chuck Collins. I live in Boston. Thank you for coming out on Friday night. Hopefully this is will be one of the better one of your better options for a program. And I want to talk about this moment we're in terms of the inequality picture, but I want to thank John and my friend Joe. And I also have a colleague with me from Boston, Annie Martinez, who works in our program on inequality, and we're here doing a couple events this weekend. But I want to, John mentioned I grew up, in an advantaged family, and just to set the context, I grew up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I'm the great-grandson of the meat packer Oscar Mayer. So if you ever had an Oscar Mayer hot dog or the Lunchable or seen the Wienermobile go around, that's actually, he was a real person. He was my great-grandfather, came from Germany, with a recipe for sausage, started a butcher shop, several generations later. So when I was 21, the company actually sold to a big conglomerate, and a lot of wealth flowed into our family. And I inherited some money at that point that I used to pay for college and do some things. But I want to say that one of my first jobs out of college was I worked with tenants in mobile home park communities where people own their home but not the land under their home. And these parks would come up for sale, the owners would sell them, and sometimes everyone was evicted. And so our organization, I worked for this organization, this company that basically worked with the tenants to buy the parks and own them themselves. And so this is like 1985, 86. So right around that time, the late 70s and 80s was when, I would sort of date the beginning of this period of growing inequality. It's really when it started. It's when wages, and it's hard to get this picture, but after World War II, like 1945 to 1975, the rising tide sort of did lift all the boats. The bottom fifth saw their incomes double, the middle income saw their incomes double, and even the richest fifth saw their incomes basically double. But starting in the late 70s and 80s, real wages started to sort of basically flatten out, and they've pretty much stayed flat for several decades. So here I was working with these tenants, and I kind of got to know, I would call it an intimate front row seat to how people were surviving with their wages, paychecks pretty much flattening out. And I saw people working more hours, more members of the household going into the workforce, people borrowing money to pay their bills. There was a lot of stress as a result of that. Imagine, you've worked for 20 years and every year you get a pay increase, your paycheck goes up a little bit, all of a sudden you're getting a pay cut or you're seeing nothing. So I had that kind of visceral connection because these were the people I was working with, and I was kind of like getting to know each of their individual financial information so that we could figure out how people could come together and buy these parks. So that was one piece of the picture I got. The other piece, though, was growing up in a rich family. I was also watching what I call assets multiply, meaning people that I went to high school with, people in my extended family. Others would say, oh, we bought our house back in 1958 for X, and we just sold it for 50X. Or we're invested in investments where assets are increasing 27% a year. And even the money that I had inherited when I was 21 doubled by the time I was 26, best as I could tell through no effort on my part. So what I was seeing was what I call wealth multiplying at the top end and wages flat. And that's the picture. And so fast forward to today, 2018, where are we at? Well, here's the picture. Those real wages have pretty much stayed flat since the late 70s. There's a little bit of wage increasing now. The median income has gone up just a little bit in the last 2 years in a way because, well, if you think about it, unemployment is so low that lots of employers are saying, well, we do need to pay workers a little bit more to attract them to work wherever. But the real overarching story is half the population, we're not talking about 10%, but half the population has not shared in the economic gains of the last 40 years, really since before the internet, before cell phones. Half the population hasn't shared. And I think that tells us a lot about the moment we're in, because I think a polarized economy gives rise to a polarized politics. And we'll come back to talk about that. So that's a piece of the picture, what's happening for most workers. But the other piece of the picture is what's happening at the very, very highest end of the economy. And since in the last 10 years, since the economic meltdown of 2008, most of the gains in income and wealth have gone not to the top richest 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. Meaning the top 1 out of 100, top 1 out of 1,000 really, that tippy top group. To join that richest 1/10 of 1%, we're talking about people whose incomes are over 2.5 million, whose wealth is over 20 million and up. Most of the gains going to the top. And the higher up we go up the economic ladder, the more concentrated the income and wealth gains become. So we, Annie and I at the Institute for Policy Studies every year do an analysis of what's really happening at the very, very top. We now know that the richest 400 households, all of them billionaires, have a combined wealth equal to the combined wealth of the bottom 64% of the population. Think about that. And 3 people, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, their combined wealth is more than half the population combined. And how is that possible? Because 1 out of 5 households has 0 or negative wealth. So they're not even really showing up on the wealth screen, if you will. They have nothing to fall back on in terms of savings and a cushion. And the next 5th has very, very little. So a lot of people are what I call underwater. They owe more than they own. They don't have any kind of savings cushion. That's the picture we're at today. And we just did a study last week that looked at the wealthiest families in the United States. Anybody have any guesses? What are the wealthiest families in the United States? Were there multiple generations among the richest group? The Rockefellers. The Rockefellers were 100 years ago in the first Gilded Age among the wealthiest families. And there's still Rockefellers around, but they're not among the super richest families. But you are right. That is one of the. But any other ideas? Yeah. The Waltons. Yeah. The Waltons are the wealthiest family in the United States. The next wealthiest are the Kochs, the 2 brothers who own a big private energy company, Koch Industries. The next wealthiest are the Mars Candy family. So any of you who on Halloween probably had a Mars candy bar of some kind or another, Mars candy product. Those 3 families have seen their wealth since 1982, seen their wealth go up 6,000%. That's hard to visualize that, but they're old wealth dynasties, really, multi-generational wealth dynasties that are seeing their wealth expand. So I would just say we're in this moment of extreme inequality at the top, and we've been pulling apart for a couple of decades now. So one question is, does this really matter? Who cares, right? What does it really matter? We know that obviously poverty matters, and raising the floor and having more people having a decent life matters, but does it really matter how rich the rich are? Is that a relevant concern? And what I would just point out is that there's now a lot of research showing that gap, the pulling apart, if you will, actually undermines almost everything we care about. So what do we care about? Well, we care about our health and our physical health and the health of our communities. Extreme inequalities of wealth undermine our well-being and health. It's bad for democracy because concentrations of wealth are also concentrations of power. So, we see the influence of money in our democratic system. A few wealthy donors can kind of pretty much get their way, not entirely, but it's essentially really warps our democratic institutions to have such an imbalance. It's bad for the economy. There's all this research showing that, if you care about a functioning, healthy, free market capitalist society, that these extreme inequalities of wealth are really bad for economic growth. I mean, think about it. Half the population doesn't have the money to go out and buy a car, let alone, stimulate the economy through their consumption. So there's not enough aggregate demand or not enough spending power. And the wealthy have so much money that they're sort of getting more and more interested in the speculative side of the economy, the gambling, betting on the futures of this and that. And so that creates a kind of instability. So extreme inequality actually creates volatility, hurts economic growth, bad for the economy. So I could go down the list, but basically there's now a mountain of research showing across a lot of disciplines that we should be really concerned about these levels of inequality. So then the question becomes, what do you do about it? What are the kinds of things that we could do to reduce these inequalities? And actually, I'm curious, if you were elected to Congress or the Senate, do you have a proposal that you would put on the table that you think might help reduce these inequalities? Anybody have anything they want to put out there as part of your campaign plank? Yeah. Get rid of regressive taxes. So there's a lot of thoughtfulness in your comment there, which is, okay, we have a tax system and we have regressive taxes, meaning taxes that tend to fall on lower income people, middle income people more than the wealthy. So one way to get rid of, restore a more progressive tax system. So that's one of the ways in which we could reduce inequality. Someone else had an idea too, I saw. Anybody else? Shout it out, yeah.
Reversing Citizens United, taking money out of politics.
Yeah, so part of that, we have all this wealth and power, and it's influencing our political system. Can we protect our democracy from big donations? Can we limit the impact of money on politics? And Citizens United being a Supreme Court decision that kind of opened the floodgates to more money in our political system. So we got two good proposals here. Anybody else want to venture one out? Yeah.
Setting a standard for schools, public schools, because many kids, if you live in a wealthy area compared to one in an impoverished area, might not have the same opportunities as those kids.
Yeah, so making investments in education. A lot of education is paid for by property taxes, so maybe finding other ways to pay for education. That's a great plank. So now we have the beginnings of a program. And there's no one single, intervention or policy. What I find is it's helpful to think about how do you reduce inequality in three categories. One would be things that raise the floor, policies that lift up the floor, like raising the minimum wage or having universal health insurance. Another category are things that level the playing field, create opportunity, like investing in higher education, investing in early childhood education. And then there's things that address the concentration of wealth and power at the top. So that would be like your idea of taxing, bringing back a progressive tax system where the wealthy pay a little more. So those are the kinds of things. And it's, I would think there's, I just did this book called, can we reverse inequality in the United States? Is inequality in America irreversible? And we look at all the things that we could do in those areas. And I think it's worth noting that we actually know something about this in the United States, because after World War II, we had this 30-year period of relative shared prosperity. We saw a rapid expansion of the middle class. We saw many people, first generation, buying a home, going to college, first generation going to college. We had massive investments in infrastructure. All those things, boosted and reduced inequality and saw that period of growing together. I don't know if any of you followed Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders had this line that I like to imitate. He said, under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, right? It's kind of a joke because Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican, but he's basically saying in the 1950s, Bernie says, the wealthiest 1% paid 3 times more income tax, twice as much inheritance tax, and we invested it in debt-free college, first-time homebuyer loans, infrastructure, right? So that was one of his campaign lines. So we know something about how to reduce inequality from those years after World War II. One thing we should remember is that those programs were very helpful for building a white middle class. But because of discrimination in mortgage lending toward Black and Brown and First Nations people were not able to get access to those low interest loans, those 1% mortgages. I actually have an uncle from Ohio. He's not from the hot dog part of the family. He's from my mother's side of the family, who bought a farm for 1% 40-year fixed rate mortgage. That's what was available 1952, Veterans Administration mortgages, 1% 35-year fixed rate mortgages. That's what helped propel, put a lot of white families on the express train to the middle class. There's a caveat there. We know something about how to build shared prosperity, but we left a lot of people out. But we could follow that same formula. So that's one. The other thing is to look at how is it that other countries, other free market capitalist societies have way less inequality than the United States. One is like looking at the Nordic countries or Canada. They have a high social floor, meaning they have a decency floor that you don't have to, you don't have to worry that you're going to become destitute. That there's a minimum wage, that there's minimal social welfare, there's early childhood education, there's all kinds of ways in which we keep it, that people cannot fall below that floor. And there's debt-free higher education. I spent some time in Denmark, and one of the families that I got to know well, the students would go to college. Instead of taking on debt, they would get a stipend while they were in college to help them cover the costs of being a student. If you were 35 years old and you lost your job, you would go back to what they call a lifelong learning retraining program. 18 months, you would get a stipend so you could go back to college and re-skill yourself to get a job. And in that, instead of in the United States where, and this is probably some of your situation, you're working part-time to be able to go to college, you're juggling, you're stretched, older people lose their jobs or they want to get skills but they can't take the time to get the training. That's not the struggle that people have in the Nordic countries. So they have a higher floor, they have public investments that help everybody have equal opportunity, and they also have a progressive tax system that limits the wealth and power at the top. And But my experience was even the rich people in those countries supported the system. They were like, yeah, I pay high taxes, but my kids go to college without going into debt, and my parents are going to get long-term health care, and I'm not going to have to be wiped out financially because of that. So even wealthy people support the system because it benefits them, and it also creates a better sense of security and well-being for their neighbors. So they're not sitting there going, you know, are my neighbors going to be destitute? Are they going to rob me or whatever? You know, it's less overall stress and fear in the culture. Not to say these are utopian societies. They actually are more homogeneous and they're smaller scale, but there's something we can learn from that. It's possible. So that's a little bit of how we reverse these inequalities. And I want to mention a couple things that I think are really cool. In California, students are organizing to pass an initiative. Their proposal is restore a tax on inherited wealth in California that's only paid by households with 10 million and up. When a parent dies and there's a substantial inheritance going to the kids, a portion of that is taxed and funds a education college for all fund, free community college, free college at all levels in California. So there's a huge movement in California of students pushing for that. In Colorado and other states, there are now movements to pass living wage policies, policies to encourage employers to pay a decent living wage. And I was just in Durango, Colorado, where the 150 employers in the town have taken a pledge to pay a living wage. They range from restaurants all the way to regional hospitals. And they publicize those companies, and people take their spending and consumption dollars and spend money at these companies because they're paying a living wage. So you see communities organizing around that, or to raise the state minimum wage, just to raise that floor. And even, Arkansas and Missouri, two states that are fairly conservative, passed ballot initiatives on Tuesday to raise the minimum wage. So there are kind of efforts all across the country trying to address these inequalities. One thing maybe I'll close with a thought, but I would love to hear any questions, thoughts you have, comments on this. But the other thing that gets in the way is we have powerful stories, I think, that justify these inequalities. So sometimes people will say, okay, I heard that, the richest 1% has 42% of all the wealth, but those people in the 1% deserve what they have because they work harder and they deserve to get what they have. And people who don't have a lot of wealth kind of deserve to be where they are. Anybody ever heard that, when you heard anybody talking that? Yeah. I mean, it's a powerful, and what's interesting is that there's a little kernel of truth in that, right? All of us can think of people who are go-getters and work hard and deserve to be rewarded for that. And maybe we could think of somebody who's like a slacker and doesn't really show up, and should they be? So we take these stories that we have of people who have different motivations, and we sort of project them onto these larger economic inequality trends. So we come away thinking, oh, well, the people who have, that level of wealth, they must bring exceptional skills and add value to society, and they should be rewarded. And everybody else doesn't work as hard. That's what I call the story of deservedness, or the myth of deservedness. And it's one of the things that I think holds these inequalities in place. Actually, Joe was reminding me that the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty. Anybody heard of J. Paul Getty? There's the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, right? He was asked, how do you become rich in America? And he said, it's really simple. You just have to do 3 things. We could do a poll here. 1, get up early every morning. How many people got up early this morning? Yeah. 2, work hard all day, including going to a Friday night lecture. Okay. 3, find oil. Nobody. Okay. So that was his formula. But when people hear these statistics about inequality, some people say, oh, well, that's because some people got up early, worked hard all day, invented a better mousetrap. Here's my response to that. The levels of inequality that we're talking about here are delinked from anything having to do with work and deservedness. These are what you call systemic inequalities. It's like the system now is on autopilot. Wealth is piling up over in one area. The gains and productivity gains are flowing to stockholders and shareholders and business owners. Wealth is creating wealth, multiplying at one level. And stagnant wages are leaving people behind. This has nothing to do with differences in individual effort. And yet, that myth, oh, Joe's over there because he works hard, and Annie's over here because she doesn't work as hard. That's, oh, no, a new mic. Just to keep you awake, I'll keep using it. So that's what, so this gets to the thing where it's like, no matter how much information, how many facts I might present about inequality, that's not going to necessarily change anyone's outlook, right? So how do you change that dynamic? If somebody has a powerful story that basically says, hey, those people over there deserve what they have, and those people over there deserve to be where they are, how do you change that? And I want to offer one clue on that, which is, a couple of years ago, I was part of an effort to defend our national inheritance tax, what's called the death tax or the estate tax is what it's actually called. It's a tax on, today it's a tax on individuals with 11 million or couples with $22 million. That's when the tax starts, right? But a couple, 15 years ago, the thresholds were lower. And there was a national effort to abolish the estate tax, to get rid of it. The anti-tax people organized to get rid of it. Kind of what you were talking about. This was like, get rid of a progressive tax. It's the most progressive tax. It's only paid by dead multimillionaires and billionaires, right? People who could, and it's not even that huge of a tax. So, but there was this whole movement to get rid of it. And I was part of the effort to try to defend it. And in the process of that, we organized all these business leaders, all these wealthy individuals, 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires came out publicly to defend the estate tax. And Bill Gates' dad, Bill Gates himself, Warren Buffett, all these people. And one of them, I should say we did these press conferences all around the country to defend the estate tax. And at one of these press conferences, we had a guy who you'd never heard of. His name is Martin Roth. He was a software entrepreneur, and he got up and basically said, here's why I should pay the estate tax. Now, imagine you're at this press conference and he's telling his story. He says, someday, when I die, I'm going to have to pay this estate tax. I have that level of wealth, but I don't have a problem with it, and I'll tell you why I support it. And Martin says, I grew up in a low-income family. My parents worked whenever they could, earn extra money. They never took a vacation. But Martin says, I got to go to a pretty good school. I went to a pretty good elementary school and a high school. I had a great science teacher. I went to a public library that was open till 9 o'clock every night and open on Saturdays and Sundays. And that library was my sanctuary for studying. And there was a librarian who worked there who took an interest in me. And every time I came in, she was like, hey, Martin, I have a book that I think you're going to like. A book about science, or a biography of a scientist. And Martin says, look, I did not come from a wealthy family. Someone else paid for me to be able to have the education I had. Someone else paid for that library to be open. And then he went to college and he got a complete free ride from public scholarships. He said someone else paid so I could go to college. And then he went into the field of emerging new technologies. He said that was largely built through public investments in research and that created the foundations. So Martin says, I started a company. And where did I hire my employees? I went to the public university down the road. I went to the computer science lab and I hired these graduates who were someone else paid to train my employees in the foundation of knowledge they would need to work for me. And Martin just keeps going on with this story. He says, my company, my patents, I developed these products, but they were stolen by a foreign corporation. And that corporation was going to put me out of business. And the United States government went to an international tribunal to defend my property rights, my intellectual property, and they won, saving my business. And Martin says, I didn't even know this apparatus existed, let alone, someone else paid for that to be there. So, and as part of this press conference, Martin says, so last year I sold my company for $30 million. And I have 2 other companies worth about the same amount. But if you abolish this one and only tax that I may have to someday pay on that wealth, what you're basically saying is I have no responsibility to pay back the society that made it almost entirely possible for me to get where I am. And he actually pounds the table. He says, actually, I have a moral obligation to pay back the society so somebody else out there who's born in the same sort of humble circumstances as me could have the same opportunities I had. Because what a good society does is it recycles opportunity. If you get to have 30 million or 50 million or 100 million or $1 billion, you didn't do it alone. This is what Martin says. You may have worked hard and creatively, but you live in a society where together we make public investments that create the fertile ground for wealth and opportunity. And he says, if I don't have to pay that taxes, we're just pulling up the ladder. We're just basically saying that the next generation, the library's going to be closed. It's going to be closed at 6 o'clock at night, right when you need to go there. It's going to be closed on the weekend. That college is going to become a burden. You're going to have tens of millions of young people graduating with debt. The average student debt now is $36,000 a year. 40 million households, students and their parents, holding student debt. We're going to stop making the public investments in science and research that are going to allow innovation to happen. So Martin, that was the story he told. He told a story that I would describe as individuals matter, what every one of us does as an individual matters, how hard we work, what we bring to the table, but that what we do together also matters and creates the foundation for wealth creation. So I would go back to that story of deservedness to say, yes, individual effort matters and should be rewarded, but let's not forget about the things that we do together that create that foundation, and that no one does it alone. And that wealth, when you achieve a certain level of high income and wealth, it's time to recycle that opportunity, to pay a portion of it back so others can have the same opportunities you had. So I offer that as a way to say, we can change that story. It doesn't mean we're telling a story that individuals don't matter. We're just lifting up this other invisible part of the story, which is the things we do together matter. One other thing I'll just say before I close is that, so John mentioned I wrote this book, Born on Third Base, which is about advantage. It's about how some of us start the running race, if you will, quite a bit further down the running track than everyone else. Or you're born on third base from a baseball imagery. I was born where a lot of people spend their whole lifetime trying to get there. That's a really obvious example of advantage, but in the process of that, I just got to appreciate all the other ways in which someone like me has a wind at their back, 4 generations of economic stability, access to early childhood health care and education, tutoring, private schools, all these things that, some of them are kind of more invisible and some of them are pretty obvious. But I think that this, the idea that we're all sort of at this sort of same point. And part of the work that I do around this book, Born on Third Base, is just to get out and talk about how advantage works. And it doesn't take away anything. In my personal experience, it doesn't take anything away from me just to tell you the true story of how advantage works. And yet, it seems as a culture, we don't do that very well. Meaning, we have, like, not to pick on our president, but here's a guy who basically says, I'm a self-made billionaire. And then, we learn in a recent expose that he got, $413 million helping hand from daddy, Okay. Why is it that it's so hard to just say, I got help? I got help from my family. We have a candidate, nominee for the Supreme Court who said, I went to Yale, I busted my tail to get into Yale. Okay, well, we left out an important biographical detail. Your grandfather also went to Yale. You're a legacy admission. You have family help. And my theory is people don't want to talk about help. They don't want to talk about family help. They don't want to talk about government help. But if they leave these important details out of their biography, they're basically what they're saying is, hey, anyone can do what I did. Anyone could get to be where I am if you just work hard and bust your tail like me. If you're just entrepreneurial and have that. And I think that part of what I've been doing in this book, Born on Third Base, is just talking to anyone who's willing to listen, but to talk to wealthy and advantaged groups and just say, it's really important to demystify wealth and to demystify how advantage works and to bring that into this conversation about inequality, because we're kind of all walking around with this mythology like, hey, everyone is where they deserve to be. That's, if I were going to put it on a bumper sticker, that's the myth. Everyone is there where they deserve to be. But if we forget, that after World War II, only white people got on that wealth building train with those low interest mortgages and free college loans. If we leave out these details, we perpetuate that myth that, everyone is at the same spot. So I just want to close with that thought and invite you to ask any question, a personal question about my own decisions or questions about these inequality issues. And I should mention, Annie and I co-edit a website called inequality.org. So if you want to learn more about these facts, studies, actually we have, if you're interested, we put out a little newsletter on Mondays. It actually comes from me on sort of these trends, what people are doing about it. So we just pass that around. Feel free not to sign it if you don't want it, but if you're interested, we send out a little weekly newsletter. Anyway, so.
If you're in my class, some of the charts that I use in class come from that website.
Yeah. So yeah, any questions, thoughts, comments?
So I have a question. Whenever I talk about the need to raise the minimum wage, people will say, well, if you raise the minimum wage, then the prices will go up. So it really doesn't matter. How would you respond to that?
Good question. So what we've now learned from like 30 years of experience of raising the minimum wage is, you know, at the federal level and in many states raise the minimum wage. If you do raise the minimum wage at a fairly slow but reasonable clip over multiple years, some of that gets passed on to consumers in the form of maybe a higher price. Some of it is spread out over other costs. It doesn't necessarily translate into higher costs. But there are a lot of examples where maybe, for instance, food, we as a society pay very, very little for percentage of our income for food and service workers that prepare and grow food, et cetera. That is an area where maybe we should raise the wage scale and have a little higher price. Other people will say it leads to unemployment, meaning, you know, if you have a Popeye's chicken franchise and you have 10 employees and you have to raise the minimum wage, maybe you're not going to be able to pay as many employees, you'll only be able to pay 9. The reality is all those claims are like the sky's going to fall, and now we have like a lot of experience and research showing that the sky does not fall. It doesn't lead to massive price increases. It doesn't lead to shrinking. In fact, what it does is it puts more money in the pocket of low-wage workers who tend to actually spend that money in the local economy and has a positive stimulus effect. I should say there's a whole network of business and employers who support the higher minimum wage. We have a lot of employers now who get out and say, you know, if I pay a higher minimum wage, if we raise the minimum wage, I don't have to compete with low-road businesses that are not paying a decent wage. I can invest more in my employees, training them. They're going to stay around longer. There's going to be less turnover. They're going to be happier. They're not going to be working multiple jobs. They'll be able to support themselves by, you know, one job. And, you know, it's the right thing to do. Nobody can live on, you know, anybody know what the tipped minimum wage is for restaurant workers? Any of you work doing? $2.13. Okay, some of you know from personal experience. $2.13 is the tipped minimum wage. It hasn't moved in decades. Other questions? Anything's game? Yeah.
Sorry. This is not really fair to ask you this. You mentioned raising all votes, right? And how some places the minimum wage is different. Like Texas, it's 7 something, or maybe 8. And then say Seattle, it's 15, or it's getting to 15 slowly but surely. So my question is, in a capitalistic system that's built to where companies try to make the most profit, right, as much as they can, it seems the only way to change the system is through policy, right? Something where it's required that all things. So that really what that tells me is that the only way to change it is for people, right, to affect policy change. Into settings like this, getting more knowledge and affect policy change. The question I guess is, how do we change an apathetic community to do that? Change the apathy. That's what it is basically. If everybody gets involved, then we can make a difference. But how do we get more people involved?
Yeah, I think part of it is a lot of people have given up on the idea that we can do big, meaningful changes. You know, and you know, like, but think about what I was saying about the students in California. If you could pass that initiative in California, 2.2 million students, instead of graduating with debt, are going to graduate without debt, just like the previous generation in the 50s and 60s and 70s did. I mean, we're not talking about a new idea. We're talking about going back to what we did after World War II. But it's a big idea that would fundamentally improve the quality of life for a lot of people. As a result, there's a lot of motivation. It connects to something meaningful and real. It doesn't, you know, when I think about apathy, I think it's people are stretched. They don't have a lot of slack in their lives because they're having to work multiple jobs, because they're stretched between work and family and caring for children, caring for parents. There's like it's kind of like a formula, a recipe for not having the time to be civically involved. But if we can find things that really matter to people and show, well, the good news is there's overwhelming support for public policies to reduce inequality and move us toward more like a Nordic model. When people are asked, what kind of society do you want to live in? People say, I want to have more sense of security and well-being. I don't want to have the sense of insecurity and precariousness. I want to have a decent wage where I don't have to work 60 hours a week. Then what is the American dream? Be able to own a home, be able to take a paid vacation, be able to retire before you die so that you can live your golden years and do whatever you want, leave something for your children, have access to decent health insurance. I mean, is that really so radical? So most people want that. And that's the good news is, even though politically it doesn't look at, if you look at the national level, at the base, there's a realignment happening. And the candidates who run with that kind of program will ultimately, I think we'll see a shift. So, but I think it's finding things that matter, and engaging people. So young people, having a decent minimum wage is an important thing. Having less college debt or no college debt. Affordable housing is a huge issue for a lot of people. And yet our cities are becoming more and more unaffordable. There's more and more kind of speculation in real estate at the top. In Boston and a bunch of other cities are looking at how about a high-end real estate transfer tax on luxury buildings and luxury condominiums, and have that fund affordable housing access for first-time home buyers and younger people. So, I think linking things together that matter, I think would be really helpful and give people a stake and a reason to fight for something. Yeah.
About raising minimum wage, I feel like there's a lot of businesses out there that if you do raise the minimum wage, what they'll start doing is outsourcing. And with no restraints on it, of course, if you're here and you're making products built somewhere else, if you don't bring them back in with tariffs on them, there's nothing going to stop them from doing that.
Yeah.
So, I think the start of fixing the problems with the big businesses, Jeff Bezos,
Right.
those companies, even him, he wants to raise the income, his minimum wage to $15, but he's taking away stuff from his employees because he doesn't want to give away his profits. And he has profits that, like you said, his grandchildren will live off of. It's just a greed. We have to do something to stop the corporate greed. I think apathy, yes, but also the corporate greed. We're all starving. It's hard to feel sorry for someone else who's starving also. It's just like you have your own issues that you do.
Yeah. Well, I think you just made a number of really important points, but one is the way in which people are pitted against each other. Low-wage workers are pitted against people one rung down from them. And this is where global trade matters, for the reason you're saying. If you raise the minimum wage, remember, in being a border state, that we're competing in a global economy, and the corporations are pitting one community against another in who's going to pay less. One way to deal with that is by raising labor standards, in other states, raising through treaties, creating a level playing field so you're not competing with Mexico, who's going to be paying so much less in terms of a minimum wage. Working to help raise wage standards, environmental standards in those countries actually protects U.S. workers and higher wage jobs. So that's one really important thing, is we can't just operate in a national bubble. We have to realize global trade treaties are tools to both either raise standards or lower them. and they have been used to lower standards in the U.S. for the last couple of decades. So, did you have a question on that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I know that he's talking about raising income. However, a lot of these multi-million-dollar companies are seeing that a lot of people are wanting to raise their income, so now they're adding robots. So if you go to the movies, you go to the machine, you don't see a lot of people working.
Yeah.
You go to Walmart, that's going to start an effect because we're not getting the jobs. Our students are those who are starting up jobs that they need to have a skill, learn a skill, to get off into the real world and to actually get a career. So how do you fix that problem?
Did you have a thought there too? Or? Oh, so, great question. Because, and actually technological change is disruptive. It's having an impact on certain job sectors. I mean, it's very possible that driverless cars, as much as it might seem in the short, the 10 years from now, driverless cars or driverless vehicles could displace tens of thousands of occupations.
And today I saw that
Yeah.
they have in China robots standing.
Yeah. So one thing is to realize technology is, it's still, as much as we're told we have no control over this, it's actually a matter for societies to come together and decide what kind of society do we want to live. Like all the technological advances that have ever been promised have been told, well, this means that we will have more leisure time, more free time, less toil. But in fact, the way it's worked out is it mostly means some people get incredibly rich and other people are moved to kind of this feudal state. So we have to just realize we have some control over how these things take shape. They're not just like acts of, like European countries and Canada have way less inequality, even though they're operating in the same global technological innovative society. And one way they do that is, let's focus on building place-based occupations. Let's look at the jobs of the future. Human beings are not going to be phased out. And maybe that does mean that we have shorter work weeks, but we're able to earn a living wage working less hours, and we're all sharing in the benefit of greater automation, as opposed to having all the gains go to the top. And I think that's where, again, it's about being organized as communities to defend our jobs. And one of the things that's interesting is may sound like a wacky idea, but a lot of the Silicon Valley entrepreneur people are freaking out about the social implications of all this technology and all these labor-saving technologies. And what is it going to mean for society and for people? And they're looking at all, one of the things that it's very, very hotly debated right now in sort of Silicon Valley is, should we have a universal basic income? Should we basically have a guaranteed minimum income for everybody? And it's not so utopian. Richard Nixon, when he was president in 1974, proposed a guaranteed family income, meaning everybody gets a minimum, not enough to stop working, but enough to kind of stabilize families. If you lived in Alaska right now, you would get a check every year from the Alaska state government, a share of the oil wealth from Alaska's, Alaska residents have this minimal universal basic income. That's the kind of thing that is not inconceivable. If we go to organize ourselves with technology to the point where people don't have to work as many hours, then we have to find other ways to sort of sustain our livelihoods. So that's a long answer, but it's basically saying, just remember, humans have some control over this, and we together should have some political control over how that unfolds in our future. Yeah.
I feel like inequality is more about more of a cultural thing more than policies. I feel like companies or like big rich people always find ways to get around policies. And I researched Adolf Hitler one time, and he said something about when he was proposing taxing more of the rich. It's not about the rich helping the poor. It's about a German helping a German. That the joy of life isn't how much money you have, but the joy of life is being able to help others. Even if you're in a bad spot, there's also going to be someone in a worse spot for you. So maybe it's more about our cultural and our way of thinking that should be changing first before our policies to always get around that somehow.
Really good point. No, and one thing I would add is these extreme inequalities that we're living through. I've been trying to make the argument that they actually are bad for everyone, even the super rich. Meaning that if we just keep going down this path toward pulling apart, we're going to become more like kind of a Brazilian society, which is a really wealthy elite, a kind of precarious, shrinking middle class, and a large, insecure class. The British have a word for it. They call it the precariat, the precarious class. And that's going to be, right now that's maybe 60% of the population, meaning that people who used to think that they had a stable middle class standard of living are like looking over their shoulders going, maybe not for my children. And that basically we're heading in that way. And if you think about, nothing against Brazil, but if you think about a society where the rich live behind walls, drive their bulletproof Mercedes-Benz from their enclave residence to their enclave shopping area, send their children to school with bodyguards, it's essentially a kind of an economic apartheid society. Is that really what you want your children and grandchildren to grow up in? And what kind of instability does that lead to? And there's a kind of a dystopian, if we don't intervene to reverse these inequalities, we're sort of basically on that track. So that comes back to your point, which is this really in anyone's interest? And how do you reweave a kind of a culture of solidarity, of we're in this together, that an injury to you is an injury to me? And unfortunately, the more a society pulls apart, the more that breaks down, that culture of solidarity. But I think I've been trying to make the argument to the 1%ers that actually you don't want to go down this road, and step up. My message to the richest 1% is time to come home, time to bring your wealth back to the community, take it out of the hidden wealth, offshore tax system, stop dodging taxes, come back to the society, put your stake back into a place, invest in, the common-weal. And it's actually in your selfish interest to do that. And, there's obviously a segment of the rich that are unreachable. They're happy to live happy to have the system working the way it is, happy to have everybody fighting amongst themselves and having the wealth funnel to the top. But there's a larger segment that sees that this is actually a dead end. And if they have any kind of understanding of what's happening, they want to be part of fixing it. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's bad for everybody. The good news is it's bad for everybody.